The morning of May 6, 1943, 300 miles southwest of Iceland, Oberleutnant zur See Klaus Bargsten brought U-521 to periscope depth at 0400 hours, the pre-dawn darkness his ally. For 26 months, since his first patrol in July 1941, this moment had represented opportunity. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. A slow convoy. Perhaps 40 merchant ships arranged in neat columns, 2 destroyers if you were unlucky, 4 corvettes if the British considered the cargo valuable, odds a skilled commander could work with, targets a wolfpack could devastate. What greeted his salt-crusted optics would shatter every assumption about the war he thought he was fighting. The Atlantic wasn't empty. It was occupied. Where Bargsten expected to count potential victims, he found himself counting threats. Not 2 escort vessels, not 4, not even the 8 that had become common by late 1942. The sea was alive with warships cutting precise patterns through the swells, destroyers maintaining station at intervals that left no approach vectors, corvettes positioned with mathematical precision, frigates, the new river-class ships he'd been warned about, their longer range and heavier armament making them formidable hunters. And then he saw them. The vessels that changed everything. Support group ships, additional escorts not even assigned to protect this specific convoy, roaming freely as hunter-killer groups. Their sole purpose wasn't defense, it was extermination. Bargsten counted once, then again. Then a third time, certain his exhaustion was creating phantoms. 14 escort vessels with the convoy itself, another 6 forming an outer screen, and in the distance, the unmistakable silhouette that made his throat tighten. An escort carrier, small and purpose-built, launching aircraft that would make surface running impossible, submerged transit detectable, and survival unlikely. 20 warships, perhaps more beyond visual range, for a convoy of 43 merchant vessels. The mathematics of this war had fundamentally changed, and Klaus Bargsten was among the first German submarine commanders to witness the transformation firsthand. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. This moment, repeated across the North Atlantic in May 1943, represented the culmination of a 4-year evolution that U-boat commanders had failed to see coming. To understand the shock that Bargsten experienced, one must first understand what he had been taught to expect, what 3 years of relative success had conditioned him to believe about Allied convoy protection. When Germany initiated unrestricted submarine warfare in September 1939, the Kriegsmarine possessed just 57 U-boats, of which only 22 were suitable for Atlantic operations. The number was criminally inadequate for the task Admiral Karl Dönitz envisioned, but the British response proved equally unprepared. The Royal Navy entered the war with a severe shortage of escort vessels. Just 74 destroyers remained available for all duties: convoy protection, fleet screening, patrol operations, and home defence. The mathematics were stark. An average convoy in 1940 consisted of 40 to 50 merchant ships. Ideal protection would have provided 1 escort for every 10 merchantmen, a ratio requiring at least 5 dedicated warships. Reality provided 2, sometimes 3 if the cargo included ammunition or petroleum products, occasionally just 1 if the convoy route seemed less threatened. Convoy SC 7 inches, October 1940, demonstrated the catastrophic consequences of inadequate protection. 34 merchant ships departed Sydney, Nova Scotia, escorted by just 2 vessels, the sloop HMS Scarborough and the corvette HMS Bluebell. Additional escorts were promised at the mid-ocean meeting point, but coordination failures meant reinforcements arrived late, piecemeal, and ineffective. 7 German U-boats attacked over 2 nights. 20 ships went to the bottom. The U-boats suffered no losses, no damage, not even a close call with death. This was the war Klaus Bargsten had trained for. This was the tactical environment Dönitz's wolfpack doctrine exploited with devastating efficiency. A U-boat commander in 1940 or 1941 faced escorts, outnumbered by their targets. Vessels stretched so thin across the convoy perimeter that gaps were inevitable, exploitation straightforward, and success nearly guaranteed with patience and positioning. The early war convoy escort was typically a Flower-class corvette, 925 tons, 16 knots maximum speed, armed with a single 4-inch gun and depth charges, whose accuracy depended more on luck than science. Crews described them as ships that would roll on wet grass, their short hulls and high superstructures making them punishing platforms in North Atlantic weather. Their ASDIC submarine detection equipment, effective in calm seas and against static targets, became nearly useless in storm conditions or when pursuing a maneuvering U-boat. More importantly, these early escorts lacked endurance. A Flower-class corvette could accompany a convoy perhaps halfway across the Atlantic before fuel constraints forced it to detach. The concept of continuous escort from departure to arrival remained a theoretical ideal, practically impossible with the vessels available. Convoys entered what submariners called the Black Pit or the Greenland Air Gap, that 600 to 800-mile stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based patrol aircraft, beyond the endurance of short-range escorts, where U-boats hunted with near impunity. German U-boat commanders in 1941 operated with confidence bordering on arrogance, justified by results. Otto Kretschmer, commander of U-99, sank 47 ships totaling 288,000 tons before his capture in March 1941. Joachim Schepke in U-100 accounted for 39 ships and nearly 200,000 tons before his death the same month. These weren't isolated successes. They represented a systematic exploitation of Allied vulnerability. The tactics were straightforward because they worked. A wolfpack patrol line would position perpendicular to known convoy routes. The first U-boat to sight the target would shadow at maximum visual range, surfaced, where its 17-knot surface speed exceeded most corvette capabilities. This shadower would radio position, course, and speed to headquarters, which would vector additional boats to intercept positions. The attack came at night, on the surface, from within the convoy formation itself. This was the crucial understanding that separated skilled commanders from cautious ones. The escorts circled the perimeter. The convoy interior was dark, crowded, and undefended. A U-boat could surface among the columns of merchant ships, fire torpedoes at point-blank range into targets silhouetted against the horizon, dive to evade the inevitable depth charge response, then surface again hours later to repeat the process. The British called this period the First Happy Time. German submariners used more direct language. Glückliche Zeit, the happy time indeed, or simply Die Amerikanische Schießbude, the American shooting gallery, when operations extended to U.S. coastal waters after December 1941. Klaus Bargsten's training in 1941 reflected this tactical dominance. The submarine school at Pillau on the Baltic coast taught aggressive surface attacks, confident maneuvers, and the psychological principle that escorts were defensive, reactive, and could be outmaneuvered with skill and daring. The instructors were veterans of successful patrols. There, lessons were reinforced by monthly tallies. Tonnage sunk continued rising. Allied merchant construction couldn't replace losses. Britain's supply situation grew desperate. From September 1939 through December 1941, German U-boats sank 2,475 Allied and neutral merchant ships, totaling nearly 12 million tons. The Battle of the Atlantic was a slaughter, and Germany was winning. But the Atlantic was about to become a different ocean. The transformation began not with a single decision, but with multiple developments converging over months. First came numbers. American shipyards, operating at wartime emergency production, began launching escort vessels at rates that would have seemed impossible in 1939. The destroyer Escort, or DE, was a purpose-built anti-submarine platform, cheaper than fleet destroyers, faster to construct, specifically designed for convoy protection rather than fleet actions. By late 1942, these ships were entering service weekly. By mid-1943, Multiple ships were being commissioned daily. The British contributed their own innovation. The River-class frigate, larger than corvettes, with endurance for complete transatlantic crossings, armed with improved weapons and sensors. 138 of these vessels entered service between 1942 and 1944, fundamentally altering escort group capabilities. More vessels meant different tactics. In early 1941, convoy protection operated on a defensive model. Escorts reacted to attacks, rushing toward torpedo explosions, dropping depth charges in areas where U-boats might be, then returning to their screening stations to prevent further penetration. This reactive posture was forced by numbers. With only 2 or 3 escorts, leaving the convoy perimeter to hunt a submarine meant abandoning the other merchant ships to additional attackers. By 1943, escort group size had expanded to 6, 8, sometimes 10 dedicated vessels. This allowed offensive operations. When a U-boat attacked, multiple escorts could pursue, while others maintained the defensive screen. More importantly, the increased numbers enabled the creation of support groups, additional warships not assigned to any specific convoy, positioned strategically along convoy routes, able to reinforce any formation that came under attack. Commander Peter Gretton's B-7 escort group, protecting convoy ONS, 5 inches May 1943, illustrated this evolution. His original group consisted of 2 destroyers and 5 corvettes. When U-boats made contact, Western Approaches Command vectored additional destroyers from the 3rd support group to reinforce his formation. At peak engagement, ONS-5 was protected by 16 warships. The U-boats attacking that convoy expected the standard 4 or 5 escorts they'd trained to evade. They encountered a defensive force larger than some World War I battle squadrons. Technology reinforced numbers. High-frequency direction finding, called HF, DF, or HUF-DUF by crews, allowed escorts to determine the bearing of any radio transmission. Since wolfpack tactics required U-boats to radio contact reports, sighting positions, and convoy movements, every transmission became a beacon guiding escorts to the transmitter. By early 1943, HF, DF was standard equipment on most escorts. 2 ships with HF, DF could triangulate an exact position, not merely direction, allowing escorts to hunt U-boats before they even reached attack positions. Radar underwent similar evolution. Early metric wavelength systems could detect surfaced U-boats at perhaps 5 miles in perfect conditions, becoming unreliable in rough seas or precipitation. The introduction of centimetric radar in 1942 changed detection capabilities fundamentally. 10-centimeter wavelength radar could detect a surfaced submarine at 10 to 12 miles regardless of weather, and could see a periscope at 2 miles, making surface running suicidal and periscope observation hazardous. The ley light, fitted to patrol aircraft, solved the problem of night attacks. Previous maritime patrol aircraft could spot U-boats by day, but lost effectiveness at night when submarines surfaced to recharge batteries. The ley light was a powerful searchlight coupled to radar, activated at the last moment before attack, illuminating the target and allowing accurate bombing runs in total darkness. U-boats could no longer consider darkness protective. But the innovation that most transformed the battle was flight decks on convoy escorts. The escort carrier, called jeep carriers by American crews, or Woolworth carriers by the British, was a small, slow aircraft carrier built on merchant ship hulls. They displaced 14,000 tons, carried 20 to 30 aircraft, and steamed at 17 knots, just fast enough to keep pace with convoys. These vessels closed the Greenland air gap, where convoys previously spent 4 days beyond aircraft range, vulnerable to concentrated wolfpack attacks. They now travelled under continuous air cover from departure to arrival. Aircraft could spot U-boats at ranges impossible for surface ships, force submarines to dive with their mere presence, and attack with depth charges, and, later, with acoustic homing torpedoes that actively hunted their targets. USS Bogue, the first American escort carrier assigned to Atlantic convoy duty, joined operations in March 1943. By May, 5 escort carriers were operational in the Atlantic. By September, that number reached 12. Each one represented dozens of additional aircraft patrolling convoy routes, hunting U-boats, denying the submarines the surface mobility their tactics required. The cumulative effect was overwhelming. A U-boat commander in May 1943 faced a different, tactical environment than existed 20 months earlier. Where he expected 2 or 3 escorts, he encountered 10 or 15. Where he planned to shadow on the surface beyond escort range, HF, DF operators plotted his position from his radio transmissions and vectored destroyers to intercept. Where he surfaced at night to recharge batteries, centimetric radar detected him at 12 miles, and aircraft attacked from the darkness. Where he approached, submerged to periscope depth, escort carriers launched aircraft that patrolled constantly, forcing him deep, draining his batteries, making attack positions impossible to achieve. The statistics documented the transformation with brutal clarity. In March 1943, U-boats sank 108 Allied merchant ships, totaling 693,000 tons. The Royal Navy's official historian concluded, "The Germans never came so near to disrupting communications between the New World and the Old." Then came April. Losses dropped to 64 ships, 345,000 tons. The U-boat force lost 15 submarines. May brought collapse. Allied shipping losses fell to 58 vessels, 299,000 tons. U-boat losses reached 41, submarines destroyed, 25% of operational strength in a single month. This was Black May, the month Klaus Bargsten surfaced to find 20 warships protecting a single convoy. The month Admiral Dönitz would later describe as the catastrophe that nearly broke the U-boat arm, the month that marked the irreversible turning of the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. Klaus Bargsten stared through U-521's periscope at a reality that contradicted everything his training had promised. The convoy before him represented not merely increased protection, but a fundamental restructuring of Allied naval doctrine. What he was witnessing was the culmination of lessons learned through 30,000 dead merchant seamen, through 2,000 sunken cargo ships, through years of desperate improvisation, finally crystallizing into systematic dominance. The transformation had occurred so rapidly that German naval intelligence struggled to track it. In January 1943, Befehlshaber der U-Boot headquarters in Paris still assessed typical convoy protection at 4 to 6 escorts. By March, intelligence reports noted substantial increases in escort strength, but attributed these to temporary measures, special convoys, or exaggerated crew reports from stressed commanders. The possibility that every convoy, regardless of cargo or importance, now travelled with a minimum of 8 escorts, and potentially double that number if support groups were nearby, seemed beyond credibility. Yet here was the proof, spread across 15 miles of cold Atlantic water. Bargsten's watch officer, Lieutenant Zersay Hans Meckel, had counted independently. His tally matched. 14 escorts in direct contact with the convoy formation. 6 more forming an outer picket line. The escort carrier steaming at the convoy's center, protected like a queen on a chessboard, launching and recovering aircraft in continuous cycles that made surface approach impossible. 20 warships, Meckel whispered, his voice carrying the hollow tone of a man watching certainty dissolve. For 43 merchants. The mathematics were inverted. In October 1940, 20 German merchantmen had been protected by perhaps 4 escorts. In May 1943, 43 Allied merchantmen were guarded by 20 warships. The hunted had become the hunters. The prey now outnumbered the predators. Bargsten ordered U-521 to 150 meters depth. He had no choice. Surface observation was impossible with carrier aircraft circling. Periscope depth offered only brief glimpses before the risk of detection became unacceptable. At depth, his submarine became nearly blind, dependent on hydrophone. Operators listening for propeller sounds, trying to determine convoy course and speed from audio signatures alone, attempting to calculate an intercept position for an attack that conventional tactics now made nearly suicidal. The U-521 had departed Brest, France, on April 18, 1943, as part of Group Drossel, a wolfpack of 12 boats positioned to intercept convoys south of Greenland. Bargsten's orders were standard: locate eastbound convoy traffic, report position and composition, shadow until additional boats could concentrate, then execute coordinated night surface attacks. These tactics had worked with devastating efficiency for 3 years. Donitz's operational plans assumed they would continue working. What Bargsten and his fellow commanders discovered instead was that the entire tactical foundation of U-boat operations had eroded beneath them while they were at sea, insulated in steel hulls beneath the Atlantic, unaware that the war they'd left behind in French ports no longer existed when they returned to operational areas. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first indication came not from visual contact, but from radio silence. Wolfpack tactics required regular communication, contact reports, position updates, coordination of attack runs. These transmissions, encrypted by the Enigma machines every U-boat carried, were considered secure. German cryptographers assured operational commanders that Allied forces couldn't break the 4-rotor Enigma system implemented in February 1942. They were catastrophically wrong. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park had penetrated the system by December 1942. By March 1943, decryption was routine, often accomplished within hours of transmission. Every U-boat radio message revealed its position to Allied intelligence. Every wolfpack coordination transmitted its intended target. Every tactical adjustment broadcast its new patrol line to the very forces it sought to ambush. More immediately threatening, every radio transmission revealed the transmitting U-boat's location to HF/DF operators on escort vessels. The direction-finding equipment couldn't read encrypted messages, but it didn't need to. It provided bearing to the transmitter. 2 escorts with HF/DF could triangulate precise positions. This meant that the essential first step of wolfpack tactics, the contact report that summoned additional submarines to the target, simultaneously summoned destroyers to the reporter. Bargsten had transmitted his contact report at 0430 hours, standard procedure, required by operational doctrine. He'd used his call sign, encrypted the message through Enigma, broadcast on assigned frequency, then submerged to avoid aircraft. The transmission lasted perhaps 45 seconds. Unknown to him, HMS Duncan and HMS Vidette, both equipped with HF/DF, had fixed his position to within 1 nautical mile. Before Bargsten completed his dive, Duncan was already increasing speed, heading directly toward U-521's transmission point, her crew at action stations, depth charges ready, her commander fully aware that a U-boat was now diving, blind and vulnerable, directly ahead of his approach. This was the new reality of Atlantic warfare in 1943. The actions required for U-boat success were the same actions that guaranteed detection, pursuit, and likely destruction. Radio transmission brought the pack together but brought escorts first. Surface shadowing provided positioning data but exposed the submarine to radar detection. Periscope observation enabled attack setup but created radar targets and visual signatures. Every tactical necessity became a beacon, announcing the U-boat's presence to forces that now possessed the numbers, technology, and doctrine to respond with overwhelming force. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The weapons escorting convoys in May 1943 bore little resemblance to the improvised defences of 1940. The depth charge, while still the primary anti-submarine weapon, had evolved from a crude barrel rolled off a stern into sophisticated ordnance deployed through multiple methods. Standard depth charges now incorporated magnetic and pressure fuses that detonated at preset depths, their explosive power sufficient to crush a U-boat hull within 40 feet, cause severe damage within 100 feet, and compromise systems at 200 feet. More importantly, depth charge deployment had evolved from random dropping in areas where submarines might be to precise patterns calculated to bracket probable U-boat positions. The Hedgehog projector launched 24 contact-fused projectiles in an elliptical pattern ahead of the attacking ship, eliminating the need to pass over the submarine's position, maintaining ASDIC contact throughout the attack, and detonating only on direct hull contact, confirming kills rather than creating ambiguous results. The creeping attack, pioneered by Commander Frederick John Walker of the 2nd Support Group, revolutionized anti-submarine tactics. One escort would maintain ASDIC contact on a submerged U-boat while creeping forward at bare steerage speed, maintaining continuous tracking. A second escort would approach at higher speed, guided by continuous updates from the tracking ship, dropping a precise depth charge pattern directly over the submarine's position. This eliminated the ASDIC lost contact period that occurred when a ship passed directly over its target, the crucial seconds when submarines could execute emergency maneuvers to evade attacks. Walker's most devastating innovation was the hold down, a sustained assault that could last days. Once a U-boat submerged, support group vessels would maintain continuous contact, dropping depth charges not to sink the submarine immediately, but to prevent it from surfacing. Hour after hour, the escorts would patrol above, forcing the U-boat to remain submerged, draining its battery, exhausting its air, degrading crew effectiveness through carbon dioxide buildup and psychological stress, until the submarine had no choice but to surface directly into the guns and depth charges of vessels waiting specifically for that moment. Oberleutnant Herbert Werner, a watch officer aboard U-230, survived a hold-down attack in July 1943 that lasted 17 hours. His account, verified against British naval records, describes the progression of a submarine crew toward collapse. After 6 hours submerged, air quality degraded noticeably. Carbon dioxide absorbent chemicals, spread throughout the submarine, could delay but not prevent CO2 buildup. After 12 hours, crew members exhibited headaches, confusion, and impaired judgment. After 15 hours, some men had lost consciousness. The captain, responsible for deciding when to surface, faced an impossible choice. Remain submerged until his crew was incapacitated and incapable of manning battle stations, or surface into the guns of vessels that had demonstrated they would wait indefinitely. Werner's U-230 surfaced at 0300 hours, her crew barely conscious, her captain hoping darkness would provide some protection. British destroyers illuminated her with searchlights before the conning tower fully cleared the surface. Only the arrival of a North Atlantic squall, reducing visibility to near zero, allowed U-230 to crash dive again and escape. Werner estimated 37 depth charges had detonated close enough to cause damage. The submarine's battery was exhausted, her air was poisonous, her crew was shattered psychologically. The mission was aborted. They limped back to France without having fired a torpedo. This represented the new Atlantic equation. Even when U-boats avoided destruction, escort groups could render them combat ineffective through tactics that exploited the submarine's fundamental vulnerability, limited underwater endurance. A submerged U-boat in 1943 could remain below for perhaps 24 hours if it maintained minimal speed, longer if it sat motionless on the ocean floor, but eventually physics imposed a choice between certain death by suffocation below or probable death by naval gunfire above. The escorts forcing these choices were no longer the converted trawlers and improvised corvettes of 1940. HMS Duncan, one of the destroyers screening the convoy Klaus Bargsten had stumbled upon, was a D-class fleet destroyer, 1,375 tons, 36,000 shaft horsepower, 36 knots maximum speed. She carried four 4.7-inch guns, multiple anti-aircraft weapons, 2 quadruple torpedo tube mounts, and 60 depth charges, with 4 different deployment methods. Her ASDIC was Type 144Q, effective to 2,500 yards in good conditions. Her radar could detect surface vessels at 20 miles, aircraft at 50 miles, and surfaced submarines at 12 miles in any weather. More importantly, Duncan's crew had been together for 14 months. Her captain, Commander A.H.T. Johns, had commanded anti-submarine escorts since 1940. Her ASDIC operators were veterans of multiple convoy battles. Her depth charge crews could deploy full patterns in under 30 seconds. Her bridge team operated with the coordinated efficiency of a sports team that had practiced together so extensively that verbal commands were often unnecessary. This professionalism extended throughout Western approaches, command escort groups. The formation of permanent escort groups in early 1941, rather than assembling ad hoc collections of available ships for each convoy, allowed crews to train together, develop group tactics, and build the mutual confidence essential for aggressive anti-submarine operations. By 1943, many escort groups had operated together for 2 years. Their coordination during attacks, their ability to hand off ASDIC contacts between ships, their tactical flexibility in responding to wolfpack maneuvers, represented institutional knowledge accumulated through hundreds of convoy battles. The Western Approaches Tactical Unit, established in early 1942 in Liverpool, systematized this knowledge. WATU used wargames and analysis to study every convoy battle, determine optimal responses to specific U-boat tactics, and disseminate lessons to escort commanders through standardized instruction. Over 5,000 Allied officers received WATU training by 1944, creating a service-wide understanding of anti-submarine doctrine that transformed convoy protection from improvisation to science. German U-boat training, by contrast, remained focused on tactics developed in 1939 and 1940. The submarine school at Pillow, expanded to accommodate increased U-boat production, emphasized surface attacks, aggressive maneuvering, and wolfpack coordination. These remained valid techniques against weakly escorted convoys, but weakly escorted convoys had essentially ceased to exist by May 1943. The Kriegsmarine possessed no institutional mechanism to identify failed tactics, analyze changing conditions, and systematically retrain crews for the war they were actually fighting rather than the war they'd fought 2 years prior. The result was predictable and catastrophic. U-boat commanders trained in 1942 arrived in Atlantic operational areas in spring 1943, expecting the tactical environment their instructors described. Minimal escorts, reactive defenses, exploitable gaps. They encountered instead a coordinated system of overlapping coverage, aggressive hunter-killer groups, and technological superiority in sensors and weapons. Their training had prepared them for one war. The Atlantic was fighting another. Klaus Bargsten's U-521, holding at 150 meters, represented this disconnect. His crew was experienced, his submarine mechanically sound, his torpedo load complete. None of it mattered. Above him, hydrophone operators aboard multiple escorts tracked his propeller signatures. ASDIC operators painted his hull position with acoustic pulses. Tactical coordinators plotted his probable course and speed, calculating intercept positions. Aircraft circled overhead, waiting for any attempt to reach periscope depth. The tactical situation allowed no successful outcome. If U-521 remained deep, her battery would drain, eventually forcing her to surface into waiting guns. If she attempted to close to torpedo range, the convoy's zigzag pattern and escort screen made approach impossible without detection. If she surfaced to attack at night, radar would spot her before her conning tower fully cleared the surface. If she attempted to break contact and withdraw, her submerged speed of 7 knots couldn't outrun surface escorts capable of 30 knots or more. Every option led to detection, pursuit, and likely destruction. The only tactically sound decision was to avoid contact entirely, to withdraw while still undetected, to abandon this convoy and search for less heavily escorted targets. But such targets were becoming increasingly rare. The systematic application of escort carriers, support groups, destroyer escorts, and improved sensors meant that every convoy, regardless of importance, now travelled under protection that would have seemed absurd 18 months earlier. Bargsten made his decision at 0800 hours. U-521 would withdraw to the south, attempt to find isolated stragglers from damaged convoys, avoid the main formations whose protection exceeded his capability to penetrate. It was a tacit admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that the Battle of the Atlantic had fundamentally shifted, that U-boats were no longer hunters but hunted, no longer predators but prey. He transmitted a brief radio message to headquarters. Strong escort, 20 warships estimated. Breaking contact. The transmission lasted 12 seconds. It was his death warrant. HMS Vidette's HFDF operator fixed the bearing instantly. HMS Duncan confirmed from a different angle. The triangulated position put U-521 at 12 nautical miles southeast. Both destroyers turned toward the contact at maximum speed. The third support group, operating 30 miles north, received the coordinates and vectored 2 additional destroyers to block likely escape routes. Aircraft from HMS Biter, the escort carrier with the Convoy, launched a submarine search patrol over the designated area. Klaus Bargsten had 9 hours left to live. The hydrophone operator aboard U-521 detected the change at 08:15 hours. The ambient ocean noise, the distant rumble of convoy propellers, had been joined by something closer, higher-pitched screws, moving fast, growing louder. "Destroyers," he reported, his voice professionally calm despite the tightness in his throat. "Bearing 190, range decreasing." Bargsten ordered silence throughout the boat. Every non-essential system was shut down. Crew members stopped moving. The submarine became a steel coffin drifting in 3-dimensional space, trying to become invisible to the acoustic pulses that were even now searching for her hull. The ASDIC pings arrived at 08:32 hours. That distinctive metallic echo, bouncing off U-521's pressure hull, returning to receivers aboard HMS Duncan. Contact established. Range 2,200 yards. Bearing confirmed. Depth estimated at 150 meters. Commander Johns aboard Duncan didn't hesitate, the textbook creeping attack. HMS Vidette would maintain ASDIC contact while approaching slowly, continuously tracking the submarine's position. Duncan would follow Vidette's directions, approaching at speed, dropping a precisely calculated depth charge pattern directly over the U-boat's position. At 0900 hours, Duncan released 10 depth charges set for 120 and 180 meters. The explosions, muffled by depth and distance, still reached U-521 with devastating force. Not direct hits, but close enough. Glass dials shattered, light bulbs exploded, cork insulation rained from overhead pipes, men were thrown against bulkheads. The submarine groaned, her hull plates flexing under pressure waves that exceeded design tolerances. Bargsten ordered maximum depth. U-521 dropped toward 250 meters, approaching her crush depth of 280 meters, hoping the destroyer's depth charges weren't set deep enough to follow. For 20 minutes, the submarine held in the abyss while ASDIC pulses searched above, seeking the echo that would guide the next attack. The pulses found her at 0930 hours. Vidette and Duncan had been joined by HMS Sunflower and HMS Loosestrife from the 3rd Support Group. 4 escorts now held contact on a single U-boat. The systematic destruction could begin. The pattern repeated every 30 minutes. ASDIC contact. Approach. Depth charge pattern. 10 explosions each time, bracketing U-521's position, each attack causing cumulative damage that degraded systems, weakened hull integrity, and eroded crew morale. By 1100 hours, U-521's batteries were at 30% capacity. Her emergency lighting flickered. Hydraulic systems for diving planes showed reduced pressure. 3 men had been knocked unconscious by the concussions. Carbon dioxide levels were rising despite chemical absorbent deployed throughout the boat. By 1300 hours, battery capacity had dropped to 12%. The air was thick enough that breathing required conscious effort. Crew members were exhibiting confusion, impaired judgment, and delayed responses to orders. Bargsten calculated remaining time before battery exhaustion, perhaps 3 hours if they maintained minimal speed, less if they attempted evasive maneuvers. The mathematics were absolute. U-521 could not outlast 4 destroyers with unlimited fuel, fresh crews, and continuous reinforcement from support groups. Surface warfare offered only slightly better odds than suffocation below, but at least offered the possibility of scuttling with the crew alive. Bargsten made his decision at 1400 hours. They would surface. They would man the deck gun, if time permitted. They would scuttle the boat, according to protocol. They would surrender as prisoners of war rather than die by suffocation in a steel tomb at the bottom of the Atlantic. At 14:20 hours, U-521 began her final ascent. Emergency ballast blow. The submarine rocketed toward the surface, her bow breaking through at 14:23 hours, less than 800 yards from HMS Duncan. The destroyer's forward 4.7-inch guns opened fire before U-521's conning tower fully cleared. The first shell struck the base of the periscope housing. The second penetrated the pressure hull just forward of the conning tower. The third detonated against the deck gun mount before a single German sailor could reach the weapon. Bargsten, standing in the conning tower, attempting to coordinate scuttling procedures, was killed by shell fragments from the fourth hit. His executive officer, already badly wounded, ordered abandon ship. The demolition charges, set before surfacing, detonated at 14:26 hours. U-521 broke in half and sank stern first in less than 2 minutes. HMS Duncan and HMS Vidette recovered 23 survivors from the water. 19 U-boat crewmen died in the sinking. Klaus Bargsten's body was not recovered. The engagement, from initial HF-DF detection to final sinking, had lasted exactly 6 hours. It represented not exceptional tactical brilliance by Allied forces, nor particular incompetence by German submariners, but simply the new baseline reality of Atlantic warfare in May 1943. U-boats were being detected, tracked, and destroyed systematically, repeatedly, with industrial efficiency. The month's statistics told the larger story. 41 U-boats lost in May 1943, 43 lost in June, 37 in July. The operational U-boat force, which had peaked at 240 boats in May, was being destroyed faster than shipyards could replace losses. More critically, experienced commanders and trained crews were dying. Their institutional knowledge, their hard-won tactical adaptations, died with them. On May 24, 1943, Admiral Dönitz ordered a temporary halt to North Atlantic operations. The wolfpacks were withdrawn from convoy routes. The offensive that had nearly starved Britain in March had collapsed by May. The U-boats that had ranged freely across the Atlantic for 3 years were now refugees, hiding in remote waters, avoiding contact with the convoy system they'd once terrorized. The Battle of the Atlantic continued for 2 more years, but its outcome was decided in May 1943. The transformation from minimal escorts to overwhelming force, from reactive defense to aggressive hunter-killer operations, from technological parity to Allied superiority in sensors and weapons, had fundamentally reversed the tactical equation. The hunters had become the hunted. The predators had become prey. Klaus Bargsten's final radio transmission, strong escort, 20 warships estimated, breaking contact, entered Kriegsmarine intelligence files as one of hundreds of similar reports from May 1943. U-boat commanders across the Atlantic were discovering the same reality. The war they'd trained for no longer existed. The convoys they'd expected to find were protected by forces that exceeded their capability to attack. The shock of surfacing to find not 2 escorts, but 20, not defensive screens but aggressive hunter-killer groups, not vulnerability but overwhelming strength, broke the psychological foundations of U-boat operations. Commanders who'd been trained to press attacks with confidence found themselves calculating survival odds instead of targeting solutions. Crews who'd felt invincible in 1941 felt hunted in 1943. The transformation hadn't required revolutionary technology or unprecedented resources. It required sufficient numbers of adequate ships, systematic application of tactical lessons learned, and the organizational discipline to maintain continuous pressure rather than sporadic responses. The Allies had built these capabilities methodically over 3 years, absorbing terrible losses while learning how to protect convoys, then applying those lessons with industrial efficiency once resources became available. For German U-boat commanders, the transformation seemed to occur overnight. In reality, it had been developing incrementally since late 1941, accelerating through 1942, reaching critical mass in spring 1943 when numbers, technology, and doctrine converged to create overwhelming superiority. Klaus Bargsten and the crews of the 40 other U-boats lost in May 1943 weren't defeated by superior German tactics or Allied brilliance. They were defeated by mathematics, by logistics, by the systematic application of resources to a problem that Germany could no longer solve militarily. The U-boat arm would continue fighting until May 1945, but after Black May 1943, it was fighting a war it had already lost, attacking convoys it could no longer threaten, facing odds it could no longer overcome. The morning Klaus Bargsten raised his periscope and counted 20 warships, where his training promised 2. He witnessed the end of Germany's last realistic hope to win the Battle of the Atlantic. The ocean that had seemed so vast, so full of vulnerable targets, so favorable to submarine warfare, had become a hostile environment where every radio transmission brought hunters, every periscope observation risked detection, and every convoy traveled under protection that transformed attacking submarines from predators into victims. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.